the first thing that mistake that a lot of people make, or that they haven't really considered, is that you have this hidden guarded documentation. So someone says, "Oh, well, we have this information, right? It exists in our in the database that you can access with the development tool, right? So it's there." And oftentimes the people who are saying that are people who have access to those development tools, right? And they're not, they don't realize what it's like to not have that knowledge, or to not have that access, right? Or some people are just not, they have an overdeveloped sense of security and protection around this content, and feel that sharing the metadata content outside of their small group either is going to present some security issue that they're oftentimes it's not easy to describe, or may, in some cases, frankly, undermine the value that they think they have with that, by sharing that knowledge out. So I call this the data knowledge chasm, right? So that there are a set of people who understand how to access this information and have the security rights and privileges to the tools to access this information around the metadata, and that gives them great power and knowledge, and it's very limited to people outside of that. So you want to, those people who are kind of locked out, you want to open that up to them. So, if you're currently, the only way to get that is to use like a SQL developer or a manager tool or Toad or something to go in here, then the problem with this is that you can't just sort of go and give people access to SQL developer and SQL management and Toad and these development tools, because that does create a security issue. The security issue there is that, like, all right, for a report writer, maybe this makes sense, but for a lot of the point of this catalog is that people can access this metadata and understand the information around your data somewhat openly, right? Have a pretty open access to people in the organization in a place that is not connected to access to the actual data, right? So in order for someone to come in and poke around and see what the metadata is for the tables and what might be there in these developer tools, you are also kind of inherently, without a lot of trickery on security and access in these tools, you're also giving them access to the data, which means you'll be able to see the PAI, and that's, so people aren't willing to give them access to this because they're fearing they're conflating the issue of the security around the data with security around the metadata. So if you can liberate this information outside of the developer tools, you can actually create more security by continuing to control who can access the data and share that metadata out, and not have to grant access to people to these tools just for the metadata. So a lot of times what happens in this chasm, in order to get there, someone has to know the data system exists, know how to get access to it. If you're lucky, there's online documentation, but if not, then get permission to access the system. Wait, maybe it's behind a firewall, you have to get in there. You get a login, you have to install some VPN or remote desktop, determine the tool, like, oh, I got to load Toad or SQL Developer, and install and configure those tools, and then get in. But wait, now you realize you have access to that. So that's a lot of work to get through to that metadata. So we want to destroy that whole chasm and take the metadata out and put it in other things. Now, that sort of means convincing the people who are currently the gatekeepers for that to allow access to the metadata separate from the actual data, and it might be very difficult for them to separate that, because they've often thought of those two things. In their mind, access to the metadata is just paired with access to the data. So let them know it is okay to broaden access to the metadata. Knowing about the existence of the data is not the same as seeing the data. That they they can see the value of severing that access to continue and even more strictly manage access to the data by severing the metadata access from the data access. So another thing, some people choose to limit data access by hiding the existence, and I don't think that's really a great idea. So like another reason people might do this is say, well, I don't want people to know that there exists a field in the database called SSN. I think that's kind of silly, right? If you're doing security correctly, people shouldn't be able to access that. But your people within your organization who are trying to build reports and trying to understand your data should know that there is a field called SSN, right? Hiding the existence of that field is not super helpful. So creating open access to that metadata and then offer an entry point to request access to the known data is a really better way to manage that. All right, so hopefully I've beat that topic into your head, and you can have some arguments to use or some persuasive things to build buy-in with those gatekeepers. All right, so the next one is building from only one point of view. Now, we've already talked about this a lot, but you've got your technical folks and your functional folks, and some people think, I only need a data. If I'm documenting the technical data model, I can just have supplemental data on here that describes the columns, and that is my business glossary, right? And that's causes problems, right? Because it's not always one-to-one. Or on the other side, we've got people who say, well, I have a business glossary, and I'm just going to create under each one of under the functional terms, I'm going to say the table and column that exists in, and they're going to say, well, that's creating my other glossary. But the problem with that is that also assumes that there's a one-to-one there. So having a repository for catalog and having a repository for glossary, and then a way to connect between them is really the way to go in our sense. So, and understand what people want to do with these different systems and how to engage between them is really important. All right, as I already mentioned this a bit too, but thinking the technical documentation is too hard. So this is if there are these issues I've already talked about around the gatekeepers and depending on the tools you have, the ability to create this. But as I mentioned, the hardest part, in my opinion, about data governance, we're going to talk about it next week, is writing business glossary definitions. That is this human curation and collaboration effort. Right? If you can, there are tools that exist, tools like ours, other tools out there that can make the technical documentation and technical catalog step very simple if you can get past the gatekeeper. And having that information makes the other things easier, right? Writing a business glossary can be much easier to do if you've got good technical information to help provide more context or more information or more ideas on what to do from that standpoint. The other mistake that people have is that they say, oh, well, we have this product, this particular vendor's product for human resources, and they provide a website with technical documentation on their data model, and we have this other product where we have a tool that we can run that generates a Word document and this, and we have this other product that generates that, and they think, oh, we've solved this problem. Now, to be fair, that's better than nothing at all, but what that means is that someone who you're trying to understand your data has to remember, well, where do I go to see the information on that database? Where do I go to see the information on that database? Where do I go to see the information on that database? And so those siloed independent tools can become issues. Now, when you're talking about having a unified architecture, there is something that you can leverage that either as whatever that information is that's produced by those can be a source of import into a tool like the data cookbook or something else, or you could just make sure that in your central repository that you give people a way who are engaging with that central repository to link out to or find those sources, right? But don't make it a treasure hunt. Give them a central point of contact out to that. So I don't want to dismiss this because it's much. I mean, I encourage all vendors to provide documentation for their things in whatever platform that they want, but also know that there are problems when you have all that siloed documentation as well. Another common mistake is frozen or dated documentation. And this is, describing the situation that you start a data governance project and you say, we're going to, export or import or document all of the tables and columns and all the technical metadata in this data system, and we're going to, import it into our data governance tool, or we're going to, dump it out to this website or whatever you're talking about, and then you do that, and then you never update it ever again, right? You don't have some sort of process or plan to update that as changes come to those data systems. So even if you have a tool that doesn't sort of automatically do that, you should have a plan to make sure that's up to date. Because trust me on this, and you've probably experienced yourself, that if someone has a perception that the documentation that they're looking at is out of date, there's a good chance that they're likely going to not use it, even if there's a 99% chance that it's up to date enough for what they want to do. Like, there's doubt and concern. So if you can sort of validate the fact that it is up to date, you're going to get much more adoption on that. All right, the next one is having a data catalog that's sort of unconnected documentation. Now, to be fair, this is a more complicated thing to do, particularly if you're doing this sort of in a homegrown documentation thing. What I mean by this is, I talked about all the different emergent or connected content to governance content, extended governance content with this. So I've got glossary definitions that are referencing the technical metadata through technical definitions. I've got data quality rules that are referencing it. I've got reports that are specifications and documentations that are referencing it. I have reference data that are referencing this. So there's a relationship between these multiple types of documentation content. And if you just have like spreadsheets or web pages and Word docs and things that are, even if it's in the same repository, they're the same things, but they don't actually have connections to them, you can't really understand the impact of changes. So this is a bit of a case for a tool like the Data Cookbook or other sort of unified data governance, data catalog tools that take this content from the catalog and from the glossary and all that, and it's all in a database, centralized database structure that connects that information so that you can see dependency and relationship between all that different content. So that's, it's a case for those types of tools. One thing that we realized with our cookbook is that we no longer offer like people who say like, I just want this one, I just want the data catalog, or I just want the glossary, or I just want this. Like, everybody gets everything, and the reason we do that is that it's all connected anyway, and it's just so much easier for everyone just to get all those features at once, and then grow into them and use them all. Because if they start using them, if they start doing this in separate places and they're not connected, it's just not going to work. So it's just important to think about that. So again, the glossary, the ETL, the lineage, all that kind of stuff. All right, and then the last thing is not considering points of engagement. So you can call this the binder on a shelf problem, right? So you've documented this information, you've created it, you've put it out in some tool, and you have not communicated or trained or linked up this information to where people are, how people are interacting with your data. And so people aren't engaging with this content. So we talked about this, or we will talk about this in our sort of customer service approach to data governance best practices. But if you're talking about like whether or not people are using this tool or using this content, it's and adopting it, you need to understand that there's an exchange between the content and engagement. So having a million-page binder of complete content is not very useful if nobody knows that binder is, nobody ever takes it off the shelf, and nobody ever looks at it. So you want to have engagement and content, and you probably heard me say this before in some of the previous things, is it actually doesn't matter if you have all the content if people are engaging with it, and if they see a data system that isn't documented yet, and if they can request that to get documented, then that's great, right? So that's a point of engagement. Or so when we talk about points of engagement, it's sort of searching and discovery. So people are able to come and look, I'm looking for data in this particular system. Do we have metadata in this system? Is the system documented? Is it in inventory at all? Yes or no? If it is, do I have the metadata? Yes or no? Okay, now I'm looking for particular types of data, and I'm looking for every place in there that has invoice amounts or something, right? And you can search for that. And if you find it, that's great. Or maybe you have a report that's referencing that information, and you can link over to it, and that's great, right? If not, then you can request it. That's the other sort of point of engagement. And then that request will then go out to stewards and gatekeepers for review or approval or authorship or connectivity and documentation